All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special webinar. I'm Gillian Siegel, and I'm the president of the ECAJ, and on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to firstly pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I am located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of course, wherever each of you is located, and acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. Can I also just welcome our panelists, in particular, His Excellency Dr. Thomas Fitschen, the German ambassador to Australia, who so kindly agreed to talk to Peter Wertheim, the co-CEO of the ECAJ. And can I also thank both the Sydney Jewish Museum, and represented today by their CEO, Norman Seligman, and the Jewish Holocaust Centre, represented by Pauline Rockman, for their co-sponsoring and participation today. I think it's an incredibly opportune and relevant time to be having this discussion about IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, with His Excellency, because Germany assumed the chair in March 2020, so here we are almost 1 year later. And IHRA, as you'll hear during the discussion, is such an important international alliance in terms of Holocaust remembrance, Holocaust education, and ensuring that we are countering acts of denial and falsification. So I'm now going to hand over to Norman Seligman to introduce His Excellency. But can I also apologise that I won't be able to stay for the whole discussion, so I'll slip from the scene, but I do hope that you all find it particularly interesting and relevant at this time. So over to you, Norman.
Gillian, thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure for me and an honour to welcome and introduce His Excellency Dr. Thomas Fitschen. He was born in Oldenburg in 1959. And he is married to Dr. Ilona Stolkin, and they have 2 daughters. He qualified as a lawyer and gained a doctorate in international law in 2003. From 1993 to 2014, he held various diplomatic positions, notably on the permanent mission of Germany to the United Nations in New York. And from 2015 to 2018, he worked for the Federal Foreign Office, where he was the Director for United Nations on Counterterrorism and International Cyber Policy. From 2018 and 2019, he was with the German Federal Foreign Office, where he was the Special Representative for Cyber Foreign Security, Cyber Foreign Policy and Cyber Security. Since August 2019, he has been the German Ambassador to Australia. He's been a very good friend of the Jewish community, and it's indeed my pleasure to welcome him to today's webinar. Introducing and talking to him will be Mr. Peter Wertheim, who is a long-serving member of the Jewish and wider community. In 2003, Peter was made a member of the Order of Australia for his services to the Jewish and wider communities. Peter is the co-CEO and Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and he will now interview the German ambassador about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Norman, and welcome everybody. It's great to see my colleagues here, Norman, Pauline Rockman from the Jewish Holocaust Centre, and also welcoming people from around Australia who have registered and have logged on today. So this is truly a national event. It's one of the benefits of Zoom that we can all get together and do these sorts of things, which are not so easy to do in person. Just 1 or 2 housekeeping things. I will interview Dr. Fitschen, and we'll begin that very shortly. I do also want to make it clear that if you want to ask a question or you have a comment, please use the chat function on the side. We will endeavour to get through all of them if we can, time permitting. We've got 1 hour. I'll start the interview very shortly, and then once we've finished, I'll call on the president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre, Pauline Rockman, to do the vote of thanks. That will conclude the proceedings. If there's anyone who doesn't know how to use the chat function by now, I feel very sorry for you, but that's about the only facility we have to do it. Otherwise, we would have to unmute everybody, and it's not manageable that way. So please bear with us. If you do have trouble using the chat function, then let us know through email or through a text or whatever, and we'll do what we can to assist you. If you have my personal phone number, you can always text me the message and I can try and get it in that way. So without further ado, it's great to see our good friend, Dr. Thomas Fitschen from the German Embassy here in Australia, who's been here now for nearly 2 years, I think. And the opening question that I have for you, it's a relatively straightforward question, but it may require an extended answer, Dr. Fitschen, and that is, just as Gillian noted, Germany assumed the presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on the 3rd of March 2020, so it's almost 1 year exactly. And the position is being held by Ambassador Michaela Küchler. What have been some of the highlights of Germany's presidency of the Alliance over the last year?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you very much also for the kind words. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah? Great. Yeah, thanks for that opening question. And taking over the IHRA chair in 2020 was also a particular moment, because as you all know, it was founded in 1998 at the initiative of the Swedish Prime Minister. And it was the 20th anniversary of the key founding document, the Stockholm Declaration. So it meant a lot to us to assume the chair in this 20 years later. And not precisely under the German chairmanship, but a couple of days before, IHRA adopted another very important document, the 2020 Ministerial Declaration. And we have ministerial meetings annually, but a declaration that re-emphasized the importance of the work of IHRA, that recommitted each and every one, all the governments at the very highest level, to the fight against anti-Semitism, against Holocaust denial and distortion. That was a very important document as well. So I think we got quite a very important and good start at the beginning of our chairmanship. We did hold 2 annual meetings, but unfortunately not as foreseen live in person in Berlin and Leipzig, as everybody had hoped to see. But both of them were completely held online. Think of 35 plus countries, a couple of international organizations, experts from all over the world who negotiate and work on texts over the internet. I think that was no small achievement, even on the technical and organizational side. So we are quite happy that everything went well. There was no interruption of IHRA's work during the COVID. As Ambassador Küchler told all of you last time when she was also interviewed via video link, one of the 2 key priorities for the German presidency was the fight against Holocaust distortion. The minister had at the time announced the forming of a global task force against Holocaust distortion, a network of experts from all around the world, experts in public memorial sites, museum work, all kinds of public education. And I'm happy to report the first and most important result of that network. 1 year later, we have adopted in 2021, or have published, a handbook that is entitled Recognizing and Countering Holocaust Distortion. And the important point is, the subtitle is Recommendations for Policy and Decision Makers. So we try to break down all the doctrinal work on Holocaust distortion into practical recommendations, things that our people and institutions and governments can really do. There are chapters on, in the first place, why should we counter Holocaust distortion? What is it in the first place? How do we respond to Holocaust distortion? What can policymakers do? There are guidelines for monitoring Holocaust distortion. There's a chapter on methodologies, on domestic and international cooperation, also on the need to have sustainable long-term funding for institutions involved, and what to teach, and plenty of other practical information. So that is really important. I think that we get down from the very high level political language, make it digestible, understandable for practitioners so that they can work. So we are quite proud that this came out under the German fair in time in January. Second big priority, and again we were successful, was the working definition on anti-Gypsyism or anti-Roma discrimination. Work on that had been going on in the Committee on the Genocide of the Roma for quite some time. The draft was discussed at the virtual Berlin plenary and then presented in its final form and adopted at the Leipzig plenary on 8 October. That is also, I think, a particularly important document, because for a long time, and this is acknowledged in the declaration, the neglect of the genocide of the Roma has contributed to prejudice and discrimination that many Roma communities still experience today. And it's important to bring it back into public knowledge, into public opinion, and that's why the working definition is important. You all know we have the other working definition on anti-Semitism, but again, it's a proposal how governments, societies, everyone interested should work with the phenomenon of anti-Roma discrimination. We had long discussions even on the proper title. And so that's why it's now anti-Gypsyism / anti-Roma discrimination. And in the US and Canada, they would call it anti-Roma racism. And the point is really that all IHRA members and everyone else who wants to work with that definition use the equivalent national terminology. So the IHRA didn't want to subscribe to a single definition or a single term, but really keep it open and make it adaptable to various contexts, because some IHRA members don't have Roma minorities. So for them, it's a little bit of a different approach. But of course, all IHRA members were supposed to join the effort. That's why in the very term, it's flexible and adaptable to national policies and the national situation. Before the working definition was adopted, we had a statement on rehabilitation also at the IHRA plenary, at the first one, the Berlin plenary. That's also an important text because here IHRA, for the first time officially in official language, condemns all attempts to rehabilitate the reputation of persons who were complicit in the crimes of the Holocaust and the genocide of the Roma. IHRA expressed its resolve to address the phenomenon of rehabilitation in member countries across the organization because, and that's the common conviction, all countries and societies have to address somehow and come to terms with their respective past by dealing openly and accurately with historical record. On top of this, Ambassador Küchler delivered 4 official statements. One on government responses to COVID-19, one on Holocaust distortion at the Querdenker demonstrations in Germany, another one on the occasion of the storming of the US Capitol, and finally, the last one, 1st of February, a statement on the suing of Holocaust historians in Poland. This is something that Ambassador Küchler took very seriously, because these statements, I mean, those are not negotiated statements, not negotiated among 34 member states, but it's something in the discretion of the chair, and it's important that the IHRA chair becomes visible, makes statements, and can react fairly quickly to international and national events. So that's what she did 4 times, and of course we can discuss the details a bit later. She also delivered various speeches, including at the B'nai B'rith commemorative event, together with Ursula von der Leyen, the chair of the European Commission, the Director General of UNESCO, Madame Azoulay, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, and the Director of the OSCE Office on Human Rights and Democratic Institutions. I will get to that person a little later. We also used the opportunity for some German initiatives. For one, Germany passed legislation to give the IHRA Secretariat the status of an international organization. That's now being processed through various parts of the German legislative. So that gives them right to have office, it gives them legal protection, gives them certain customs and tax privileges, right to freedom of travel to and from the seat. So that's an important legal security that Germany has given to the IHRA Secretariat. Finally, two documents, and then I would conclude and give you a chance for another round of questions. But that is also very important. The European Union published a handbook for the practical use of the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism. That was commissioned by the European Commission and published jointly with IHRA and with support from the German presidency at the time. The working definition on anti-Semitism, as we know, has become a widely used tool around the world to educate people. But there again, and that takes me back to the other document, breaking it down and turning it into a practical tool for practitioners, for civil society, for anyone who's interested, is also important. And that's why this almost 60-page handbook was published. It lists 35 good practices, ranging from training for law enforcement personnel to incident recording and reporting, and also 22 sourced incidents of anti-Semitism, which can serve as a kind of educative tool for anyone working with the handbook about the situation when manifestations of anti-Semitism need to be assessed and reacted to. So there again, we have a very practical document. It just came out and is being forwarded to interested institutions, of course, also outside the European Union. There are a couple of other German initiatives, but I think for now I would give the floor back to Peter for an initial question, but I'm happy also to respond to questions concerning what Germany has done locally. The latest campaign, 1,700 years of Jewish life in Europe, all of that falls somehow under the umbrella of IHRA work, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that opening. It does help to set the scene. The first question comes from my colleague, Vic Alhadeff, who is the CEO of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, which is the New South Wales constituent of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Vic says, congratulations to the German government on appointing Dr. Felix Klein as the Commissioner on Anti-Semitism 2 years ago. He's been a very active exponent of the cause of combating anti-Semitism. Could you perhaps give us, just on the subject of Germany's internal work and its own processes, an idea of what Dr. Klein has been working on since his appointment, and will the incoming Chancellor maintain this appointment?
Well, to start with the last one, I mean, having this commissioner is such an important, he represents such an important institution and the voice that is definitely needed. So my guess, I can't, of course, predict what the new Chancellor will be doing, but I'm personally pretty sure that this institution will be continued. Absolutely, it's in a very important role. On his work, he is organizationally within the Ministry of Home Affairs, but of course separate. And he was really the face and the voice of countering anti-Semitism and also supporting many of the organizations in Germany. He has a budget of his own, so he can also fund certain institutions. One of them, for example, is the Federal Association of Departments for Research and Information on Anti-Semitism. That's a long title in English. The German abbreviation is RIAS. And that RIAS has established a network where civil society organizations can report anti-Semitic incidents. The idea is not to have that network operate as the operational arm of German law enforcement, but it's really to report situations so as to raise awareness, to make to strengthen small, medium NGOs working on the issue, to have them connected so that they can cooperate, that they can engage with each other, that they can empower each other. And these incidents are being reported also for scientific research on anti-Semitism, because in the long run, we will have some good statistical data. We know where and how anti-Semitic incidents happen. So that's an important initiative, and Mr. Klein has also funded this network. So there again, and of course also in all kinds of political questions that involve in one way or the other the government, but need this independent voice. And he is, as you know, he is a very outspoken person, ready to engage, ready to commit, ready to fight for or against anti-Semitism and for the protection of Holocaust memory. So that's, I'm sure, that position will continue.
Thank you. You mentioned three things in your answer there that I think we need to explore a little further. The first is I guess the message from the top coming from government. That's a very important factor in countering anti-Semitism. The second thing you mentioned was law enforcement, giving some teeth to the standards that have been adopted. And this was the subject of a question from John B. Ziegler. And the third thing, of course, research and education, which must necessarily be an integral arm of any program to combat anti-Semitism. How does the German government see the balance, I guess, between these three different categories of tools for combating anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, we have discussed the German penal code provision already last time, that we have a fairly strict and strong legislation against Holocaust denial and the most blatant cases of anti-Semitism. And that's why we have put the emphasis so much on Holocaust distortion. The outright denial and open anti-Semitism are easier, I would say, to tackle. But the level below, distorting facts, raising doubts, being critical, minimizing the extent or the facts in the first place, denying facts, that's difficult to capture. So that's why we put very much emphasis on that side, below the level of law enforcement, below the level of criminal responsibility, because these two levels, I mean, the law enforcement level is very important, and all our police and law enforcement institutions are, of course, aware of that. But below, the societal discourse, especially now that under COVID conditions, we have to rely so much on internet communication. It's so easy to, I want to avoid the term to fake news, but really to be indifferent and to present facts in ways that are not appropriate, that do not do justice to what has happened. So that's where we put some emphasis in. And that's a lot more difficult to counter, because you need, for example, the media institutions, newspapers, the advisory boards of public radio and public TV. All of them need to become aware and not only be able to analyze, but really to be able to and committed to and really empowered to counteract this.
Thank you. Just on the subject of one aspect of law enforcement, there is a public inquiry in Australia at the moment into extremist movements and radicalism. It's being conducted by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. One of the terms of reference refers to the public display of hate symbols. Now, I'm aware that Germany, for obvious reasons, has particular laws relating to the public display of the Nazi swastika. We are looking at this now in this inquiry as a possibility. There obviously needs to be some exceptions for the display of the swastika when it's not in the context of promoting hatred. For example, when it's a Hindu symbol, for example, it's a well-known Hindu religious symbol, or when it's in the context of an academic discussion about Nazism and the use of propaganda and so on. So I'm asking, what can Australia learn from Germany's treatment of this particular issue?
That's again a difficult question, because conditions of what figures as a right-wing extremist party in Europe, or movements in Europe and Australia, are still a bit different. But of course, we know that right-wing extremists are well connected around the world. We have similar movements in many other countries, and they do communicate via the internet. So that's the first thing, I think, that we do exchange experience, that we do exchange and make each other aware of our observations on how all these organizations cooperate, how they are linked up, and how they communicate. So as to be aware of not only our little national situation, but really about the international connections, that this is maybe not necessarily a global movement, but a very widespread movement that shows up in different forms and guises. And that's why, again, referring back to the two statements that Ambassador Küchler has issued on the Querdenker demonstrations, for example, that's a very instructive thing. This is a movement that is becoming visible very much in Germany, to everyone's surprise, because we always thought, well, we are so rational and can be convinced easily, but that's a pretty strong movement who doubts the existence of COVID or the danger of COVID, and questions all the rules and regulations. And they come up with, for example, they put the yellow Judenstern on their jackets. They sport comparisons. They use terminology that each of us listening to today would clearly consider as Holocaust distortion or with an anti-Semitic background. But then again, it's presented and done in a casual way. So you really have to look carefully, and you have to speak up against it. And this is what Ambassador Küchler did, and what the whole government did when the pictures were broadcast. There were statements from the minister, from Chancellor Merkel, clearly condemning what was going on, and clearly pinpointing that this is not some casual and haphazard way of communication, but there is a message behind this. They're doing this on purpose, and this needs to be countered. So there again, our law enforcement people and everybody below in civil society and in other institutions who deal with it, we need to be made aware of each other's observations. That's, I think, the most important thing for the moment. Plus, of course, classical law enforcement when it comes to prosecuting our criminals.
Just on the subject of conspiracy theories and their adaptability, the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, recently made a very good speech where he acknowledged that anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting phenomenon. It can adapt endlessly to any kind of conspiracy theory to fit into contemporary events, which makes it all the more important that that governments and non-government organisations and those who are countering anti-Semitism are agile enough to accommodate and to address the changes that occur in major anti-Semitic themes, and particularly arising out of COVID. One of the problems, of course, is that online platforms such as social media and so on have given a megaphone to these conspiracy theories, which were once relegated to the focus of society. Again, it comes back to both education and regulation, but has Germany focused on this problem of online proliferation of anti-Semitism? Is this something that Felix Klein in particular, and perhaps other agencies in the German government, are addressing?
Yeah, as you have already mentioned, the speech delivered by our foreign minister, a couple of others I could mention, but there are, for example, just recently, Germany was one of the co-sponsors of an online campaign That's called Protect the Facts. That's a media campaign about Holocaust distortion. The idea is to raise awareness, to learn facts. It's geared towards a younger generation of internet users. So it's shorter messages. It comes with easy to understand graphics. It comes up with campaign style slogans, which are probably easier for a younger generation to digest. The idea is to reach a broader audience and to have a voice on the internet. That was a co-production by IHRA, the United Nations, and UNESCO. And I have mentioned UNESCO already earlier, but that's the International Organization for Science and Education. And having UNESCO on board, and of course the UN as such, who has the who runs the Holocaust Remembrance campaigns and organizes the memorial festivities on the 27th of January. Plus, it runs a global campaign against genocide and crimes against humanity. Having these important international actors on board is also very decisive, because we have to feed this message that there is a problem, that we have to be aware of what's going on the internet through all kinds of fora and channels, as many as we can. And I would like to make another observation again, which I referred to a bit earlier. The point is also that governments, whether IHRA members or not, provide steady funding to all these organizations. It's nice to have NGOs watch the internet and follow what's going on and being networked and reporting incidents. But the point is that they have a reliable basis to continue their work. This is not a 1 year, an annual effort that we can be happy to forget next year, but it's a permanent task. As the minister said, it keeps shifting its appearance, it keeps changing its outer face. So the organizations dealing with it need to be sure of continuity. That applies also to access to archives, to preserving historical records. It's a long list of measures that helps in going against these tendencies.
One particular phenomenon that is emerging, we've noticed in Australia and possibly in other countries, are attacks on the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, supposedly on the basis that that working definition designates any kind of criticism of Israeli government policies or actions as anti-Semitism. Now, we're well aware of the fact that the working definition itself expressly excludes that. On the other hand, the working definition does have some clear worked examples where ostensible criticism of Israeli government policies and actions is actually just the cloak for anti-Jewish discourse and the promotion of anti-Jewish views, or political commentary is couched in classical anti-Semitic language of conspiracies and stereotypes about Jews. This is a growing phenomenon, and it's good to see that many governments and non-government institutions have resisted that and have adopted the working definition despite those criticisms. What resources can IHRA deploy and the German government deploy to counter those arguments and to set the record straight?
Yeah, I mean, let me respond a bit as a lawyer that I am. The working definition was never meant to be a legal basis for either censoring public statements or to be enforceable in a criminal law sense. It was a working definition was adopted as a tool for practitioners so that they can judge situations, that they can that they have a guideline how to assess certain incidents and situations. So was never meant as a legal tool. So you can't say my statement is not like this, but I said something else. That's why it's not anti-Semitic. As much as you can't say, well, it's like this, so it is an anti-Semitic statement by definition. The working definition needs to be applied. It's a tool to assess situations. And I think that's an important point also in the debate about whether it's a good or not so good definition. The point is that we have a tool. that we need to apply and work with. It doesn't give you the solution. It opens the discussion. It opens a trajectory for debate and commitment and engagement. I think that's the whole point of the definition. So of course you can cloak any type of statement in other words and then pretend, oh, I didn't mean it like this and the definition doesn't cover this exactly, so I'm free to say what I want. But it's a framework to analyze and to assess. That's, I think, the purpose of the definition. So we shouldn't allow it to be cast away as being, well, old-fashioned language that doesn't fit anymore. It was never meant as the one final clear definition on everything anti-Semitic. It's a tool.
Nonetheless, it is troubling to many of us who observe these events that these particular groups are seeking to make the working definition itself the issue rather than anti-Semitism the issue, and in particular forms of anti-Semitism which are put forward ostensibly as anti-Israel or criticism of Israel policy. So from the point of view of civil society organisations like ours, what would you recommend as the approach? I mean, we don't want to be bogged down into an argument about the definition. On the other hand, we don't want to let these misrepresentations about what the definition says to go without rebuttal. So it's a little bit of do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as I said, I think it's important to explain the purpose of the definition. It's the same a bit in the anti-Roma or racism working definition. The authors have tried a definition, a couple of lines on what the phenomenon is, and then they gave examples. But of course, lists of examples are never complete. And that's the whole point. The examples given both in the anti-Semitism definition and in the anti-Roma definition are exactly that, examples. You can come up with a zillion other situations and examples that would also fit under the definition or fit under the purpose of the definition. And that's why I think on the one hand, you would have to play down the definition. It's not a legal definition. And on the other hand, defend and keep it up as a tool, as a kind of weapon in your hands to counter distortion, and not get engaged in legal hair splitting about the meaning of this or that part of the definition, but really defending the point and the purpose behind this.
So the European Union has actually, as you mentioned earlier, published a very useful booklet about the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And coming from the European Union, not just from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, it carries the weight of all of the member governments of the European Union. But that's this is a learned document. It's a government, it's sort of an official publication, if I can put it that way. Not everyone who's engaged in social media will read these things. Social media tends to be a lot less detailed, I can put it that way. Is there, do you think, some merit in the idea of EU officials and also government officials, that is officials of member states of the EU, themselves publishing much shorter op-ed pieces and social media pieces that are more digestible for wider consumption to try to counter some of these attacks on the working definition of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's of course always a good idea, and that's also again the whole point of the handbook, to really hand the tools for statements, for engagements, for public speaking appearance, for being on conferences, talking to individuals that this handbook does. But maybe if you get away from the EU officials level, I mean, one important thing that was so successful in Germany is still to bring Holocaust survivors, members of the Jewish community in Germany and all the other countries, to have them meet with young people, with organizations, speak at Holocaust memorials, at archives, at all kinds of historic places, share the experience, talk about what they have suffered, and really inspire youth directly. We shouldn't forget that this is a very important part, as numbers of Holocaust survivors are dwindling, of course. That is even more important, and that we keep and preserve their voices, that we share the documents, that preserve the documents, that we provide access to documents. And I would like to seize that opportunity to point out just one more initiative. You know, the Owls and Archives, that they have 30 million documents on more than 17 million people having perished or having been affected by the Holocaust. That's a huge archive, mostly in German official records, but of course it's not accessible for online research or from international researchers. So they have just mounted an initiative, and it's a kind of crowdsourcing initiative, getting volunteers together who read all these 30 million pages of documents. And whenever they come up, they encounter a name, type down the name, put the name and whatever information is being made available into an online research tool, so that between now and 2025, that's the perspective, all the documents in the Owls and Archives may be accessible for international researchers. And the idea is to engage young people, young volunteers who just like the idea of committing time and energy to this worthy cause, and have them help out. So that's a modern tool. It is via the internet. It's crowdsourcing, stroke crowdfunding. It's something where you can engage for longer or shorter periods. You just donate part of your time and your energy, and that's a very nice way of engaging larger parts of the young generation, because it's all online, and you can really exploit a bit their technical capabilities. So that's maybe one way of getting away from the EU officials level and to engage younger generation.
Well, you've made the really important point there about the importance of personal engagement beyond official documents and pronouncements and so on. And you also made the important point that, unfortunately, Holocaust survivors are becoming fewer and fewer. Those who are left are now in their 90s for the most part, maybe even older. And it becomes more and more difficult for them to be able to have their voice, and for younger generations to have that personal encounter with a survivor, which can have such an impact. Is there, again, on the theme of personal engagement, is there something other than involvement with the Bud Arison archive that we can recommend for younger people? Is it, things like meeting other Jewish students, or speaking to a descendant of a Holocaust survivor? I mean, I'm just trying to think of other alternatives that we can use in the future to personal survivor contact. I mean, personal survivor contact has been a major theme of our two co-sponsors, the Sydney Jewish Museum and the Jewish Holocaust Centre. They both have done great work with Holocaust survivors, guiding people around and speaking to them, influencing thousands of younger students. But we're not going to have that forever, unfortunately. So I'm looking now for some more creative ideas about personal engagement. And I just wonder whether this is something IHRA and Dr. Felix Klein and the others are working on.
Yeah, but that's a question that I would love to pass on to the Australian IHRA members and of course everybody else. IHRA is not just 34 governments. It's really a global network of experts in all kinds of fields. So there's an enormous potential, I think, for cooperation to generate ideas. One of the ideas, and I just have to seize this opportunity, is also teaching young generation, especially in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, about Jewish life as such. It's not the ignorance, the readiness to accept or maybe fall victim to distortion, to not to be fully informed, is also a lack of knowledge about the Jewish life in Europe and in German-speaking Europe. So fellow President Steinmeier has just yesterday opened a year-long campaign that is called 1,700 Years of Jewish Life in Germany. So you wonder why 1,700? In 321, we have the first official records signed by Roman Emperor Constantine, who granted the Cologne's Jewish community the permission to hold office in the city council. That's the first written document that we have, and that's why it's 1,700 years. The idea is to really have as many events and on as many locations as possible in Germany that speak about Jewish life in Germany, past and present, and the future also, what the perspectives for Jewish life in Germany are. So that's an important complement, I think, to the Holocaust teaching and fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial in the first place, to give a broader picture and to tell the German public, especially the younger generation, how much Jewish communities were part of Germany, of the German history, of the German-speaking European area, because that's something that is not quite clear if education at school concentrates, as it rightly does, on the Holocaust experience and the persecution under the Nazis. There's more to say on Jewish life in Germany. So that's one of the chances to reach out to young people in Germany and make them more knowledgeable.
Thank you. Well, as somebody who's on my father's side has had German ancestry going right back to, well, probably the Reformation and probably possibly beyond. It's most interesting to get this history out there. I do wonder whether that will succeed in breaking down the centuries-long perception that Jews are alien. They're not really German. They're not. I mean, to use that old horrible Nazi expression, that they were not part of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, all that sort of stuff. History and facts are one thing, but emotions and prejudices are very difficult really to break down. Let me ask you though, this is now another question. Forgive me if it's not a diplomatic question, because I'm asking you to comment on another country, but we've recently seen two Polish historians suffering a verdict against them in a civil suit that was funded by the government for defaming somebody who was a deceased person who was a mayor, a Polish mayor of a town, who was accused by a survivor of having been complicit in Nazi atrocities. And the Polish government and the Polish legal system is very sensitive to anything that suggests that Poland as a nation was in any way complicit. Of course, we know that there was no Polish collaborator government, but we also know that there were pre-war Polish institutions which were co-opted by the Nazis and holus bolus became party to the atrocity. That's a very long preface to a very undiplomatic question, but is IHRA going to be tackling this as a form of Holocaust denial or distortion? We're not talking now about the Nazis, we're talking about their collaborators, but they were very much a part of the genocide. So how is IHRA going to handle this? It seems it's not something that can be easily ignored.
Well, of course, you may expect that from what you call an undiplomatic question, I would withdraw into some diplomatic answer. IHRA has indeed engaged on this. Ambassador Küchler has issued a statement on 1st of February, where she said on behalf of IHRA, because it's herself as the chair of IHRA, she said, and I read it out, I have the paper here. We view with great concern how historians researching the Holocaust are being sued in Poland for representing the findings of their work. So that's a very clear statement, great concern for researchers who are being sued. And then another part of the statement reads that we encourage all countries and societies to address their respective past by dealing openly and accurately with historical record. It is in light of these IHRA commitments that we address the Polish government, calling upon it to ensure the viability of free and independent research. I think that's as far as IHRA as a member country organization that includes, of course, Poland, can go on this publicly. But I think the language is, for a diplomat, pretty clear and straightforward, ensuring the viability of free and independent research. That's exactly what IHRA has been doing all the time. But of course, anyone with a scientific background or interest in the scientific accuracy of research and keeping the documents open would opt for. So that's the diplomatic answer to your very straightforward question.
May I ask whether the Polish representatives on IHRA protested or objected to that statement?
Not that I know of, but I would have to ask Ambassador Küchler whether she has had any reactions on her statement from Poland or any other source.
I'm not aware.
We can do that.
Maybe we can take that question on notice.
Yep.
All right. Ambassador, we're coming very close to the end of our time now.
Yeah.
Before I call on Pauline Rockman to give the vote of thanks, is there any last statement you wish to make?
Yes, while I have the electronic floor of all of this, I wanted to point out yet another publication from an important European organization, the Organization of Security, the OSCE. They have the Office of Democratic Institution and Human Rights. I have already mentioned them earlier. They have published already back in 2017 another handbook. I'm sure I know you're a bit critical of all these handbooks, but still, I think it's a very practical guide. That's the title: Understanding Anti-Semitic Hate Crimes and Addressing the Security Needs of Jewish Communities. And that's a very useful, in my view, a very useful document, again, for practitioners to come to terms with all these definitions and high-flying statements, to break it down into practical things. And it's security needs of Jewish communities. That's something that might also be of interest. Again, IHRA cannot claim any authorship, but of course, IHRA was consulted and contributed. So that's another important document from another organization that is strongly involved in fighting anti-Semitism and holding up human rights in Europe. And as you know, the office is located in Warsaw, in Poland. And apart from that, of course, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak and to lay it out. Of course, the IHRA presidency of Germany doesn't end next week. IHRA presidencies are run in a trio format. So the previous chair would cooperate with the current chair and the future chair. So you would have us around at least one more year before it passes on again. But I can promise that no matter whether we are IHRA chair or anything else, Germany, the German government, and of course the German embassy in Australia, my colleagues who have been cooperating on making this a success, will keep up the fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion and denial, and be on your side forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And just for clarification, I wasn't being critical of the official documents. I was just suggesting that maybe they need to be supplemented. The content of them actually is very good, and I commend them to everyone on this call. I think they're very, very worthwhile read. So look, on that note, thank you, Ambassador. I will now call on the president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, Pauline Rockman, to give the formal vote of thanks. And I want to thank everybody for participating today. Time's gone very quickly, but I think we covered a lot of territory.
Indeed, thank you. Good afternoon. And my name is Pauline Rockman, and I'm co-president of the Jewish Holocaust Centre Melbourne and a member of the Australian delegation to the IHRA. Thank you, Dr. Fitschen, for your presentation today. You have given us an insight into the important activities of the IHRA, an organisation dealing with Holocaust education, remembrance and research. You've highlighted the vital role that it plays on the international level and of Germany's contribution as the 2020 chair in the 20th anniversary year of IHRA. and which is being ably led by Ambassador Kushler, in particular in adopting decisions to counter Holocaust distortion and in adopting the definition, the working definition of anti-Gypsyism, as a whole range of stuff, including the work with the Polish government with the current court trials. I'd like to give you a quick update to Australia's role in the IHRA. Australia's application for membership of the IHRA was unanimously endorsed at a meeting in Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg on June the 4th, 2019, and as a delegate to the IHRA since 2015, initially as observer, then liaison. It is great pride that I, together with 6 other Australian delegates, witnessed Australia welcomed as a 33rd member country in the IHRA. And as Australians, we're all very proud to be doing this important work, and we're mindful of the legacy bequeathed to us by our precious Holocaust survivors. And now that Australia is a full member of one of the obligations is to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day on January the 27th. This happened for the first day last month on a national level when we hosted that event. From this, we're now moving towards setting up the AHMA, Australian Holocaust Museums Alliance, as we have Holocaust museums currently in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and opening in Queensland and in Canberra, and I hope I haven't left anyone out, in the near future. So Ambassador Fitschen, we thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today and for your continuing efforts in promoting Australia and German bonds of friendship and cooperation in these times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline, and thanks everybody for participating. And of course, a special thank you to our good friend, His Excellency, Dr. Thomas Fitschen, for giving us his time today. So that concludes today's proceedings. I wish everyone a good week, and thank you once again for your participation. All the very best.